nature seems merely unlikely, while the recurrence of an instant of time violates our whole concept of time order. The instants of time which have passed are past and can never be again. Any alternative theory of time must reckon with these two considerations which are buttresses of the absolute theory. But I will not now continue their discussion. The absolute theory of space is analogous to the corresponding theory of time, but the reasons for its maintenance are weaker. Space, on this theory, is a system of extensionless points which are the relata in space ordering relations which can technically be combined into one relation. This relation does not arrange the points in one linear series analogously to the simple method of the time ordering relation for instants. The essential logical characteristics of this relation, from which all the properties of space spring, are expressed by mathematicians in the axioms of geometry. From these axioms as framed by modern mathematicians the whole science of geometry can be deduced by the strictest logical reasoning. The details of these axioms do not now concern us. The points and the relations are jointly known to us in our apprehension of space, each implying the other. What happens in space occupies space. This relation of occupation is not usually stated for events, but for objects. For example, Pompey's statue would be said to occupy space, but not the event which was the assassination of Julius Caesar. In this I think that ordinary usage is unfortunate, and I hold that the relations of events to space and time are in all respects analogous. But here I am intruding my own opinions which are to be discussed in subsequent lectures. Thus the theory of absolute space requires that we are aware of two fundamental relations: the space ordering relation which holds between points, and the space occupation relation between points of space and material objects. This theory lacks the two main supports of the corresponding theory of absolute time. In the first place, space does not extend beyond nature in the sense that time seems to do. Our thoughts do not seem to occupy space in quite the same intimate way in which they occupy time. For example, I have been thinking in a room, and to that extent my thoughts are in space, but it seems nonsense to ask how much volume of the room they occupied, whether it was a cubic foot or a cubic inch, whereas the same thoughts occupy a determinate duration of time, say from 11 to 12 on a certain date. Thus, whereas the relations of a relative theory of time are required to relate thoughts, it does not seem so obvious that the relations of a relative theory of space are required to relate them. The connection of thought with space seems to have a certain character of indirectness which appears to be lacking in the connection of thought with time. Again, the irrevocableness of time does not seem to have any parallel for space. Space, on the relative theory, is the outcome of certain relations between objects commonly said to be in space, and whenever there are the objects so related, there is the space. No difficulty seems to arise like that of the inconvenient instants of time which might conceivably turn up again when we thought that we had done with them. The absolute theory of space is not now generally popular. The knowledge of bare space as a system of entities known to us in itself and for itself independently of our knowledge of the events in nature does not seem to correspond to anything in our experience. Space, like time, would appear to be an abstraction from events. According to my own theory, it only differentiates itself from time at a somewhat developed stage of the abstractive process. The more usual way of expressing the rational theory of space would be to consider space as an abstraction from the relations between material objects. Suppose now we assume absolute time and absolute space. What bearing has this assumption on the concept of nature as bifurcated into causal nature and apparent nature. Undoubtedly, the separation between the two natures is now greatly mitigated. We can provide them with two systems of relations in common, for both natures can be presumed to occupy the same space and the same time. The theory now is this: causal events occupy certain periods of the absolute time and occupy certain positions of the absolute space. These events influence a mind which thereupon perceives certain apparent events which occupy certain periods in the absolute time and occupy certain positions of the absolute space. And the periods and positions occupied by the apparent events bear a determinate relation to the periods and positions occupied by the causal events. Furthermore, definite causal events produce for the mind definite apparent events. Delusions are apparent events which appear in temporal periods and spatial positions without the intervention of these causal events which are proper for influencing of the mind to their perception. The whole theory is perfectly logical. In these discussions we cannot hope to drive an unsound theory to a logical contradiction. A reasoner, apart from mere slips, only involves himself in a contradiction when he is shying at a reductio ad absurdum. The substantial reason for rejecting a philosophical theory is the absurdum to which it reduces us. In the case of the philosophy of natural science, the absurdum can only be that our perceptual knowledge has not the character assigned to it by the theory. If our opponent affirms that his knowledge has that character, we can only, after making doubly sure that we understand each other, agree to differ. Accordingly, the first duty of an expositor in stating a theory in which he disbelieves is to exhibit it as logical. It is not there where his trouble lies. Let me summarize the previously stated objections to this theory of nature. In the first place, it seeks for the cause of the knowledge of the thing known, instead of seeking for the character of the thing known. Secondly, it assumes a knowledge of time in itself apart from events related in time. Thirdly, it assumes a knowledge of space in itself apart from events related in space. There are in addition to these objections other flaws in the theory. Some light is thrown on the artificial status of the causal nature in this theory by asking why causal nature is presumed to occupy time and space. This really raises the fundamental question as to what characteristics causal nature should have in common with apparent nature. Why, on this theory, should the cause which influences the mind to perception have any characteristics in common with the effluent apparent nature? In particular, why should it be in space? Why should it be in time? And more generally, what do we know about mind which would allow us to infer any particular characteristics of a cause which should influence mind to particular effects? The transcendence of time beyond nature gives some slight reason for presuming that causal nature should occupy time. For if the mind occupies periods of time, there would seem to be some vague reason for assuming that influencing causes occupy the same periods of time, or at least occupy periods which are strictly related to the mental periods. But if the mind does not occupy volumes of space, there seems to be no reason why causal nature should occupy any volumes of space. Thus space would seem to be merely apparent in the same sense as apparent nature is merely apparent. Accordingly, if science is really investigating causes which operate on the mind, it would seem to be entirely on the wrong tack in presuming that the causes which it is seeking for have spatial relations. Furthermore, there is nothing else in our knowledge analogous to these causes which influence the mind to perception. Accordingly, beyond the rashly presumed fact that they occupy time, there is really no ground by which we can determine any point of their character, they must remain for ever